Jack the Ripper is, without question, the most infamous murder mystery story of all time. Everybody's heard it before and everybody knows who Jack the Ripper is. Well, no one knows who he is, but everyone knows of him. So I've held off on doing this one because I don't really want to rehash something that's been told 1,000 times already. But recently I came across a theory that I found very interesting. And when you add it into the Whitechapel Murders timeline, the result is pretty fascinating. Now what I found was a dissertation on a website called Casebook from a Dr. Frederick Walker, who has a very convincing theory that the true identity of Jack the Ripper might just possibly be a guy named Joseph Barnett, the last boyfriend of the final canonical Jack the Ripper victim, Mary Jane Kelly, who officially broke things off with Barnett and kicked him out of her apartment 1 week before she was brutally murdered. Now, people have made counter-arguments to Dr. Walker's theory, and he's made some counterpoints back. The fact remains, the evidence against Joe Barnett is purely circumstantial, and would most likely not hold up in a court of law. That said though, good God, is it convincing. So, was Joseph Barnett the real name of the most infamous serial killer of all time? That is what this little mini-series is gonna cover. Now, the Whitechapel mystery is far too big for one single video, so I'm gonna do it in a series and try to cover each victim and event with as much detail as possible, while also trying to make it as easy to follow as possible. Alright, now with that all out of the way, if you're new to the channel, you should know that viewer discretion is advised. I'm rude, I swear a lot, the content is pretty graphic, and I use a lot of pop culture references in places it's probably not appropriate. But if I have to offer a positive for this channel, it's Misty. She makes appearances when it's appropriate. Now Misty really likes these catnip cookies that we get her, and for every new subscriber she gets an extra treat. And Misty wants to say thank you because she has officially eaten 30,741 treats. I'm just kidding, I haven't given them all to her yet, I don't want her to explode. But jokes aside, I just want to say thank you so much for all of the support and all of the kind words you guys have shown us, and I'm just so glad that you guys enjoy, whatever the fuck it is that we do here. Well, I'll deal with that existential crisis later, because right now, we have a job to do. And with that, the discretion notice is now over. If you're still here, please understand that the only photographs of some of the victims were taken during their autopsies. So I'll put a countdown warning on the screen before their pictures pop up so that you can look away if you don't want to see them. Alrighty guys, let's get going. Between April 1888 and February 1891, 11 women would be violently murdered in and around the impoverished Whitechapel District in the East End of London. Now, the biggest problem with the Jack the Ripper mystery is confirming just how many of the Whitechapel murders were in fact the work of Jack the Tosser. Since none of these 11 murders have ever been officially solved, all that Scotland Yard could really say for sure is that they were probably not all committed by the same person. But they're kinda certain that Jack the Dickhead killed at least 5 of these women. These 5 women are known as the Canonical 5. Any true crime podcast or channel is gonna tell you the same shit. These 5 victims are Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. And that is simply based on the fact alone that the nature of the mutilations were quite similar. However, some experts beg to differ, and speculate that Jack's 3rd victim, Elizabeth Stride, was not actually a Ripper victim at all. And this is actually based on the evidence at the crime scene. Since Elizabeth wasn't mutilated or ripped, and this was right in the middle of his killing spree, the evidence therefore suggests that she either wasn't a victim or Jack was interrupted. I personally tend to lean towards not a victim, but I'll explain why I believe that once we cover the canonical victims. Now also don't worry, this is not important right now, it's just an example of why this case is so hard to solve. There is just no way to say for sure which victims were killed by Jack the Ripper. Okay, so that's the biggest problem. The second problem is that at the time, police work and criminal prosecutions relied heavily on confessions, on witness testimony, and actually catching someone in the act, or finding obvious physical evidence that ties someone to the crime. Forensic techniques such as fingerprint analysis were not in use, blood typing had not been invented yet, so other than actually catching this piece of shit in the middle of ripping a woman, the police were about as useful as those nipples on Val Kilmer's batsuit. The fuck was that about? Another problem is that during this time, Whitechapel was basically Gotham City. This place was a fuck up. Whitechapel was considered to be the most notorious criminal rookery in London. A rookery is Old English speak for fuck up. Dorset Street, where most of the story takes place, was described as the worst street in London. I re-recorded that line a few times. Can you just also say that and see if you also struggle? Was described as the worst street in London. Let me know if you also can't say that. Anyway, why was this place such a fuck up? Well, what happened was in the mid-19th century, England had an influx of Irish immigrants. From 1882, Jewish refugees fleeing the Russian Empire and other areas of Eastern Europe immigrated into these same areas. The parish of Whitechapel became increasingly overcrowded, and the population increased to over 80,000 people by 1888. Working and housing conditions worsened, and a significant economic underclass developed. To give you an idea of how bad it was, 55% of children born in the East End of London died before they were 5 years old. Robbery, violence, and alcohol dependency became commonplace, and poverty drove many women to prostitution just to be able to survive on a daily basis. By October 1888, London's Metropolitan Police Service estimated that there were 62 brothels and 1,200 women working as prostitutes in Whitechapel, and approximately 8,500 people sleeping in the 233 common lodging houses within Whitechapel every night, with the price of what they called a coffin bed being 4p, which is about £2 today, and the cost of sleeping on a lean-to or hangover, which is just a rope that's stretched across the dormitory so people would like sit down and sleep and lean against the rope. If you've watched the movie From Hell with Johnny Depp, you know what I'm talking about, and the price of that was 2p per person, so about £1 today. So these common lodging houses, while pretty shit, provided cheap communal lodgings for the desperate, the destitute, and the transient. And most of the Whitechapel murder victims were women living in these conditions. These economic problems in Whitechapel were also accompanied by social tensions, public unrest, and protests, like the Bloody Sunday protest, where a crowd of people protested against unemployment and fought with the police. Some people died, a lot more got badly injured, and even more of them got arrested. So it was a shit time for most people, and with all that was going on, like the anti-Semitism, the crime, nativism, racism, social disturbance, violence, robbery, and prostitution, Jack the Ripper just became the cherry on top of this shit sundae. Now, another big problem is that a lot of these prostitutes at the time were actually managed by gangs or pimps, and sometimes these gangs would use tactics like violence to beat these prostitutes or scare them into submission and obedience. So due to all of the violence and attacks on women in general, it's almost impossible to be 100% certain which murders were committed by Jack the Ripper or just some other infected carbuncle of a human being. So far, there's a lot of problems in trying to solve this mystery, but to quote DJ Khaled, here's another one. Much of the original material of the case has been stolen, lost, or destroyed. So the information comes from a mix of historical police records, witness testimonies, newspaper reports, and memoirs. Now, I'm going to be using a whole bunch of different sources here that have done their homework. If you want to take a look through them yourself, they're in the description. Now that we have the scene set, we can finally get into the horror show that is the Whitechapel saga, starting off with the first Whitechapel victim, 45-year-old prostitute Emma Elizabeth Smith. Now, most of Emma's life before her murder remains another mystery, and the police files that were gathered during her murder investigation also went missing. Now, as of recording this video, this mystery is 137 years old. So fair enough. So we'll refer to Detective Walter Dew, a guy that we'll be hearing a lot from in this series. Walter Dew wrote in his memoirs, quote, "Her past was a closed book, even to her intimate friends. All she had ever told anyone about herself was that she was a widow who more than 10 years before had left her husband and broken away from all her early associations. There was something about Emma Smith which suggested that there had been a time when the comforts of life had not been denied to her. There was a touch of culture in her speech, unusual in her class. Once when Emma was asked why she had broken away so completely from her old life, she replied, a little wistfully, "They would not understand now any more than they understood then. I must live somehow." End quote. Now, at the time of her death, Emma had lived in a lodging house at 18 George Street, which has since been renamed to Lolsworth Street, which is in Spitalfields in the East End of London, and she lived there for approximately 18 months, paying 4 pence a night for a coffin bed. Then, at about 15 minutes after midnight on April 3rd, 1888, Emma was last seen by a fellow resident named Margaret Hayes, and she was standing near Farron Street, and she was talking with a man dressed in dark clothing and wearing a white scarf. Then, about 75 minutes later, just after 2 a.m., Emma returned to the lodging house covered in blood and severely injured. She told the deputy keeper, Mary Russell, that she had been attacked by a group of men, maybe 2 or 3 men, and she thought that one of them was a teenager. Now, Emma obviously survived the beating and she was able to make it all the way back to the lodging house, and by her description of her attackers, it's clearly not Jack the Dickhead. However, it's been debated whether she just refused to identify the men who attacked her or could just not describe them better than the way she did, saying it was 2 or 3 men and one was maybe a teenager. Now, if you ask the same question I did when I read that, why in the blue hell would she refuse to identify her attackers? Well, surprisingly, there actually is a reason. I'll come back to it in a minute. Deputy Keeper Mary Russell and another lodger named Annie then took Emma to the London hospital, where a medical examination revealed that a blunt object had been inserted into her vagina, rupturing her peritoneum. While in the London hospital, unfortunately, Emma would fall into a coma. She would then also develop peritonitis, and she died the following day. Damn, Houdini died of the same thing. Peritonitis, not the other thing. Yeah, moving on. No one bothered to inform the police about Emma for 2 whole days, and her murder was only reported on April 6th. An inquest was then held the next day at the hospital, which was conducted by the coroner for East Middlesex, a guy named Wynne Edwin Baxter, another guy that we're going to hear from a lot in this series. Now, this inquest was also attended by Mary Russell, a detective named Hillier, and some other Metro PD officers. The inquest jury would ultimately reach a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. Now, what's so sad about Emma's murder, and paints a very clear picture of what life was like back then for people in Emma's situation, the lead detective Edmund Reed, another guy we're going to hear from a lot in this series, noted in his report, quote, "Her clothing was in such dirty, ragged condition that it was impossible to tell if any part of it had been fresh torn," end quote. Detective Walter Dew later said, quote, "As in every case of murder in this country, however poor and friendless the victim might be, the police made every effort to track down Emma Smith's assailant. Unlikely as well as likely places were searched for clues. Hundreds of people were interrogated, scores of statements were taken, soldiers from the Tower of London were questioned as to their movements, ships in docks were searched, and sailors questioned," end quote. So clearly, or supposedly, they tried. But since Emma never provided descriptions of the men who attacked her, and no witnesses ever came forward or were ever found, the investigation into Emma's murder stalled. Detective Walter Dew later wrote that he believed Emma Smith to be the first victim of Jack the Ripper, but his colleagues suspected her murder was the work of a criminal gang. Like I mentioned earlier, East End prostitutes were often managed by gangs, and Emma could have been attacked by her pimps as a punishment for disobeying them, or even as an act of intimidation. Therefore, some police officers speculated that she may not have identified her attackers because she feared reprisal. So that could be the reason that it appeared that she didn't want to snitch on her attackers, or the attack was just random. Either way, her case was listed as the first of 11 Whitechapel murders in the Metropolitan Police files. Now, even though the press and some newspaper reports linked her death to the later murders, which were blamed on a single serial killer, Emma's murder is almost certainly not connected to Jack the douchebag. Then there would be a 4-month gap between Emma and the second Whitechapel victim, which is very interesting because we're also keeping one eye on Joseph Barnett. I'll get more into his background later in the series, but one of the main reasons that Barnett is suspected by some ripperologists is apparently what they like to call themselves, but I cringe just saying it, so I'll just say experts going forward. The main reason that some experts suspect Barnett is that he apparently did not want his girlfriend, the fifth and final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, to return to her life of prostitution. Fair enough, obviously, he doesn't want to share his girlfriend, but they had a pretty good life together. He was making good money as a fish porter, and then somewhere around this point in the timeline, late July, early August, Joe Barnett lost his fish porter's license. Now, it's unclear why he lost it, but people have speculated that it was either because of theft, drunkenness, or that he was simply being laid off. Times were hard, and Whitechapel was shit. Either way, he lost his fish porter's license, and money stopped coming into the household. So perhaps due to limited options, Mary Jane Kelly started working again. It is said that in the beginning, Joe Barnett was apparently tolerant of this, but then she started bringing clients to the room that they rented, resulting in Barnett having to leave the room and wander the streets. It's also said that most often he would end up in the corner pub called the Britannia. Now, aside from the times that Mary Jane was bringing clients to the room, she was also known to allow other prostitutes to sleep in their room. And according to Joe Barnett himself, quote, because she did not have the heart to refuse them shelter on cold, bitter nights, end quote. Now, what makes Mary Jane Kelly so interesting is how different she was from the other victims, but still fits Jack the Ripper's pattern. Not only was she the only prostitute murdered during this time who actually had her own accommodation, she was also murdered indoors, in her own room. And she's the only victim that happened to. And she also officially told Joe Barnett to fuck off 1 week before she was violently murdered. Now, I have jumped way ahead in the story, but this information is important to understand why some people think that Joseph Barnett could have been Jack the Ripper. So right now, all of this bullshit between him and Mary Jane Kelly is just starting. She's bringing people back to their room. They're fighting a lot about this. Barnett hates the fact that Kelly has to resort to prostitution again, and according to some testimonies, Barnett said that he would never allow Kelly to return to her life of prostitution again. So just keep that in mind right now. Joe Barnett is frequently having to leave the room because Mary Jane Kelly is working. And now that he's unemployed, what is he actually doing? Does he have money to go to the pub? Are people going to buy him drinks there? Is he just begging for drinks there? Or is he just wandering the fucking streets? Nobody knows what he's doing. Anyway, just keep that in mind. Then on August 6th, 1888, 39-year-old prostitute Martha Tabram was drinking ale and rum with another part-time prostitute named Mary Ann Connolly, who was known as Pearly Pole. These two ladies were in the company of two soldiers in a pub called the Angel and Crown, close to the George Yard buildings. At about 11:45 p.m. that night, the four of them paired off, and each lady left the pub with their own client. Martha and her client went down Whitechapel High Street and into an alley by the George Yard. They entered the alley through this covered archway next to the White Hart Inn. Mary Ann Connolly and her client went to the parallel Angel Alley. Now, these George Yard buildings were a block of tenement flats, so I just want to make it clear that people lived here. So in the early hours of the following morning, on August 7th, a resident who lived there, a lady named Mrs. Hewitt, was awoken by the cries of murder. However, domestic violence and shouts of that nature were common in the area, so she just ignored the noise. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you ever wondered why this mystery was never solved, what I'm about to say next will make it perfectly clear why. Just remember, Whitechapel at this time is basically Gotham City, but without Batman and his bat nipples to clean these streets up. At 2 a.m. that morning, two other residents, a husband and wife named Joseph and Elizabeth Mahoney, returned to the George Yard buildings and would later report to police that they, quote, saw no one on the stairs, end quote. At the same time, the patrolling beat officer, Police Constable Thomas Barrett, saw a weirdo just loitering in the area. So he went up to him and he asked, quote, "Oi, twat, it's 2 a.m. in the fucking morning, mate. What in the fuck are you doing, mate?"
Okay. Me? Just hanging around.
Well, the weirdo just turned out to be a soldier from the Tower of London, specifically a grenadier. A grenadier is a soldier who throws grenades at people, and he told Constable Barrett that he was, quote, just waiting for a friend. Fair enough, this guy usually throws grenades at people. Right now we should be happy that all he's doing is just hanging around. Then at 3:30 a.m., resident Albert George Crow returns home after a night's work as a cab driver and will later tell police that he did notice a body lying on the landing above the first flight of stairs, But since the landing was so dimly lit, he just thought that the body lying there was a sleeping vagrant. So it wasn't until just before 5 a.m. that a resident coming down the stairs on his way to work, a dock laborer named John Saunders Reeves, realized that this was no sleeping vagrant, but instead it was the brutally murdered body of Martha Tabram. You see what I'm saying now? This is why the Whitechapel mystery is such a disaster. Not only were there so many people nearby where Martha Tabram was murdered, they also just all seem so fucking oblivious to everything. The fucking witnesses and people standing around in the areas when these attacks happen are like NPCs, are like actual real life fucking NPCs. They all act so fucking weird, they all just seem to ignore the commotion and scuffles and cries of fucking murder because it was just so common, and that is what made it so easy for these Whitechapel killers to get away with it. The NPCs of Whitechapel. Anyway, John Saunders Reeves then ran and found Constable Barrett, who then sent for Dr. Timothy Colleen to come out and examine the body. Dr. Colleen arrived there at about 5:30 a.m, so good on him actually, he got there pretty fast, and he estimated that Martha Tabram had been dead already for around 3 hours. Now ladies and gents, back in 1888, one of the ways they would estimate the time of death was by touching the body and noting the loss of body heat. They would also judge by the color of the skin and how stiff the body was, based on rigor mortis. They would also look into the eyes because the cornea becomes opaque and then the eyeball collapses. They also, of course, use witness testimony, so at the end of the day, none of these techniques are really reliable. But they didn't have anything better at the time, this was all they had. Now, Dr. Colleen noted that Martha Tabram's killer had stabbed her 39 times in total. Now, tell me that this doesn't sound excessive, like somebody is very fucking angry about something. Martha was stabbed in the body and the neck, including 9 times in the throat, 5 in the left lung, 2 in the right lung, 1 in the heart, 5 in the liver, 2 in the spleen, 6 in the stomach, and also multiple stabs to her lower abdomen and genitals. One properly positioned knife stab could probably do the job. Why did this person stab her 39 times? That's a lot. That's 39 times too many, in my opinion. Now, Martha was found lying on her back and her clothing was raised to her midsection, exposing her lower half, which indicated the body lay in a sexual position. However, Dr. Colleen could not find any evidence of intercourse. What's interesting about this is that later Ripper victims were also found with their clothing, like their dresses and skirts, lifted above their midsections to expose their lower half. Just a little food for thought. Now, as for the police investigation into Martha's murder, this one was quite well documented. The local inspector of the Metropolitan Police Force, Edmund Reed, was once again in charge of the investigation, and he arranged for Constable Barrett to visit the Tower of London later that same day, on August 7th, in the hopes that Constable Barrett could identify the grenadier that he saw loitering in the street. Barrett, however, did not recognize any of the men. Then the police organized a parade of all the soldiers who were on leave that night, and this time, Constable Barrett did pick someone out. When he was asked if he wants to re-examine his choice, Barrett said yes and picked out another man. The first soldier was then allowed to leave, and Barrett explained that he changed his mind because the man he had seen in George Yard had no medals on his lapel, whereas the man that he selected first did. Barrett's second choice turned out to be a man named John Leary, and John claimed that on the night of the murder, he had gone drinking in Brixton with a buddy named Private Law. Now that's a pretty fucking strange name. I bet you don't hear that every day. Well, I bet you Private Law did. Now, according to John Leary, they missed each other at closing time, and John went for a walk before meeting up with Law in the Strand at about 4:30 a.m, where they had another drink at Billingsgate before returning to the Tower. Private Law was then interviewed separately from Leary, and his version of the night's events corresponded exactly with John Leary's. So, on the strength of their corroborating statements, and because of Barrett's uncertain identification, Leary and Law were both dismissed from the inquiry. Then another soldier from the Tower, named Corporal Benjamin. Was Private just his rank? Well, aren't I just a fucking idiot? Anyway, it was found out that Corporal Benjamin was absent without leave on the night of the murders. Pretty suspicious, but it turned out that he had just been visiting his father in Kingston upon Thames. Now weirdly, Mary Ann Connolly was not very cooperative, and she actually hid away from the police, and she hid with her cousin for a few days, and she didn't come forward until about August 9th. She also missed the identity parade arranged at the Tower of London for August 10th, but then she did attend the rescheduled one on August 13th. Now, when Mary Ann finally did come to check the people out to see if she could spot the clients, she said that she didn't recognize anybody, but she did tell the police that the men that night were wearing white cap bands. Now, these white cap bands were only worn by the regiment of Coldstream Guards, and they were not worn by the Grenadier Guards at the Tower of London. So in order to keep looking for this grenadier, Mary Ann Connolly was then taken to another identity parade at the Wellington Barracks, where she actually did pick out 2 soldiers, but both of them had solid alibis. One was at home with his wife, while the other had been in the barracks. Well, at least they tried to figure out who it was, but it seems like they gave up after that. Martha Tabram's body was then formally identified by her estranged husband on August the 14th. The inquest into her death was concluded with a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. No suspect was ever arrested for Martha Tabram's murder. Now, as far as I can tell, there's not really a big debate about whether or not Martha Tabram was actually a Jack the Ripper victim. Most people agree that she wasn't, and there's multiple reasons to assume that. But at the time, newspaper reports did link Martha Tabram's murder to Emma Smith's, as well as the future Whitechapel murder victims, including Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Now, over the years, these last 5 murders have become known as the Canonical 5, and most people agree that they were committed by the same guy. But again, some people don't agree that Elizabeth Stride was actually a Ripper victim. Also, at the time, the Chief Constable, Sir Melville McNadden, wrote in a memorandum that he thought an unidentified soldier or soldiers killed Martha Tabram. So surely, this can only be based on the account from Mary Ann Connolly saying that they left the pub with soldiers, and of course Constable Barrett seeing a grenadier loitering in the street. But all the suspected soldiers were cleared. Sort of, I guess. Mostly. But Dr. Colleen, who performed the post-mortem on Martha Tabram, agreed with Sir Melville's opinion and believed that 2 different weapons were used. One of Martha's wounds, which penetrated the chest bone, was inflicted with a weapon longer and stouter than the others. He could only speculate that that wound was caused by a dagger or possibly a bayonet, while the other stab wounds were inflicted with a shorter, slimmer knife. Fair enough, but I can think of another story where the killer used 2 different knives. This fucking terrible story from Japan, the Setagaya family murders. Now, on the other hand, some modern researchers have suggested that Jack the Ripper may have murdered Martha Tabram before perfecting his modus operandi of overpowering and then cutting the throats of his victims and then mutilating or ripping them after death. So what supports this idea that Martha Tabram was one of the first Jack the Ripper victims? Well, serial killers have been known to change their murder weapons and develop their modus operandi over time, which is clearly visible with Jack the Ripper's increasingly severe mutilations. If you don't agree, Google a picture of the final victim, Mary Jane Kelly's crime scene. It looks like that scene from The Shining. Right, so let's just think about this very carefully. The evidence saying Martha isn't a Ripper victim is A, there are 2 different weapon types, and B, there are no mutilations. The evidence saying she could be is her dress was lifted up past her midsection to expose her lower half, like most of the future Jack the Ripper victims. So it's not much, but there's also not that much evidence saying that she wasn't a Ripper victim. But yeah, it's just the dress being pulled up, that's all we have to go on. Now, I forgot to mention that all of the wounds had been inflicted by a right-handed person. Not sure why that's relevant, 90% of people are right-handed, so that information is about as useful as nipples on the batsuit. However, what is interesting is the 39 stab wounds. That is extremely excessive, and this phenomenon is commonly referred to as overkill. This overkill phenomenon, involving excessive force beyond what's necessary to kill, can indicate a perpetrator's psychological state, such as a loss of control due to extreme distress, or it may be a planned act to achieve a specific goal, like sexual gratification or torture. Therefore, in trying to connect Joe Barnett to this murder, assuming it's him, the only thing that makes sense is that he was so pissed about Kelly bringing other men to their room that he either just fucking snapped or decided to take revenge on the woman i.e. the prostitutes that ruined his comfortable life with his girlfriend. And or that he believed killing prostitutes with a very similar name to Mary Jane Kelly's would scare her off the streets and she would retire from prostitution. Now, how far away was Martha Tabram from where Joe Barnett would have been kicked out? About a 16-minute walk away. One more thing to add is that some experts think that if this actually was a Jack the Ripper murder, that Jack might have followed the wrong prostitute on the night of August 6th, and he actually intended to follow Mary Ann Connolly. Now why in the blue hell would they think this? Well, this might get a bit messy, but the only way that this can make sense is if I show you all of the victims' names, up until the final canonical victim and when Jack the Shitter seems to disappear forever. And I want to know if anything at all stands out to you. I didn't pre-plan how I'm going to edit this visually, so I do apologize if it's a mess. Victim 1, Emma Elizabeth Smith. Not an actual Ripper victim. Number 2, Martha Tabram. Died after parting ways with Mary Ann Connolly. Maybe, possibly, the intended target, but also not considered a canonical Ripper victim. Doesn't mean that she's not one though. Number 3, Mary Ann Nichols. The first canonical victim. Number 4, Annie Chapman. Real name Eliza Ann Chapman, and the second canonical victim. Number 5, Elizabeth Stride. Possibly not an actual Ripper victim, but still considered the third canonical victim. Number 6, Catherine Eddowes. Once told the police that her name was Mary Ann Kelly. Gave the police Mary Jane Kelly's, the final canonical victim's, address when she got arrested for drunkenness. Also once told a pensioner that she knew Jack the Ripper's name. And before she could claim the reward money, she got murked by Jack the Ripper and became the fourth canonical victim. By the way, guess who she suspected Jack the Ripper was? Motherfucking Joseph Barnett. And number 7, Mary Jane Kelly. Real name, Mary Ann Kelly. The most violent murder by far, and after Kelly's death, Jack seems to disappear and this pattern ends. Now, this pattern was pointed out by Dr. Frederick Walker on Casebook, by the way, and I realized that this is like the Charlie Day corkboard meme and pretty tinfoil hat. But what in the actual fuck are we looking at? I personally am not one of those kind of people that don't believe in coincidence and chance. But this pattern here, and that's exactly what the fuck it is, you cannot deny that, is very peculiar. But is it proof Joe Barnett was the killer? No, of course not. Is it a reach? Maybe. I don't know, but maybe when you have nothing else to go on and the only thing you can do is look for patterns, and you find something that seems to resemble somewhat of a pattern, maybe you should consider the implications of it. As in, how the hell did this happen? Is this just an accident? You'd think there'd be a little more randomness with the victims' names. I don't know. People argue that the victims didn't know each other. However, everything in the story happens within walking distance of Ground Zero, which is Dorset Street in Spitalfields. Many of the victims frequented the same pubs, and I've just shown you previously that Catherine Eddowes gave the police Mary Jane Kelly's address and used her name. And the reason for that is most likely because she actually knew Mary Jane Kelly. Catherine Eddowes' common-law husband's name, by the way, was also John Kelly. And Mary Jane once told Joe Barnett that she had about 7 brothers and 1 sister. And one of her brothers' names was John Kelly, who lived in London. Now, whether Mary Jane's brother John Kelly and Catherine Eddowes' common-law husband John Kelly is the same John Kelly is unclear, but what is clear is that Catherine Eddowes apparently knew Mary Jane Kelly. So, how would the Ripper have known all of these women's real names and aliases and whatnot? Well, if Joe Barnett was actually Jack the Ripper, he was living with a prostitute for 1 year and 8 months. And there is reason to believe, like I've just explained, that these prostitutes knew each other. Somewhat at least. So far, I can kind of follow the reasons why people believe in this theory that Joe Barnett was Jack the Ripper. However, everything is purely circumstantial and nothing puts him at the crime scene. Yet. Anyway, we'll call it here for now, and I'll have part 2 up as soon as it's done. Until then, folks, let me know your thoughts and theories in the comments, leave a like on the video, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in part 2. Thanks for watching.